We have one presentation from Vincent Casey of WaterAid, sort of bringing us round full circle to some of what Louise talked about this morning, but from a practitioner point of view. Louise was talking about getting research into practice and policy, and talking about that from a researcher's point of view, I guess, or from the point of view of an organisation which carries out research. Vinny's going to share some of his experiences as a practitioner and a member of a practitioner organisation on the linkages with research. So over to you, Vinny. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. Last presentation of the day, so I'll try to keep it snappy. So yeah, as Richard said, I'm just going to give a practitioner's point of view. I work for WaterAid in the program support unit there, which supports the service delivery component of WaterAid's work. So we're often in the field, we're often with partners looking at the work that's being done there. So I'm going to talk through some experiences that I've had, these are just personal experiences largely, on working with researchers and give some perspectives. Now, I've had an immensely positive working experience with researchers, both as part of this UPGro grant and as part of a previous other recent piece of research I've been involved in called WashTech. So I am going to throw up some problems that sometimes happen between NGOs and researchers, but I don't want Naomi, Helen, or Alison, or John, or anyone else that I've worked with in this room to kill me, because these examples don't refer to them. Okay, that has to be clear. Okay, so let's begin. I'll just say a bit about what WaterAid, what we are, what we do. We are an agency that works on water supply and sanitation and improved hygiene. And we work through local partner organizations. We don't do direct implementation unless we're working in very new country program or country programs where we would work on co-implementation with partners. So we generally work through partner organizations. And those partner organizations are local governments usually, or other NGOs. There could be a variety of people. I'm just going to go through that in a moment. But essentially our aim is to improve service delivery, improve delivery of WASH services, not just in our own programming. It's not limited to that. It's about the whole sector, influencing the whole sector to improve delivery of WASH services. So there are elements of influencing government policies in there, influencing where investments are made, development of partner capacity, development of local government capacity, local service authority capacity to deliver and sustain services, and importantly, coordinating with other actors in the sector working towards the same aims. So, got from there. So we have significant relationships at the community level and with the representatives of communities, with local government, national government, regional governments, the local private sector, local NGOs, utilities in urban environments, and donors. And importantly for this presentation, academic institutions, as well as other international agencies. Now this is our programmatic approach. So this is how we aim to use research. I wouldn't say that we are doing this systematically right now, but this is our thinking on how we should be using research and links with researchers. Basically, we have a vision of universal access by 2030. Obviously, we can't achieve that on our own, but that's our vision, that will happen. Universal access to water and sanitation by 2030. So the research that we are involved with or commission forms part of the critical analysis component. The situation analysis is analysing blockages to achievement of that universal access. Now that work feeds into our practice, the practice of partners, what we advocate as practice, and also capacity development initiatives, but importantly into advocacy as well, advocating for policy change, advocating for practice change. So that's the change aspect there. So you can see practice and advocacy in the middle there, informed by research. And then the continuous monitoring along the bottom there, that's our post-implementation monitoring and evaluations, and also specific pieces of research to understand on an ongoing basis the effectiveness of work being done. So this is the programmatic approach, and it's a cycle. And that's how we aim to use research. So what benefits do we achieve as a result of working with researchers and academic institutions? Well, many. When we work together on research with researchers, there are obviously more rigorous methods of inquiry than there would be perhaps if we just went about this ourselves. Rigorous literature reviews, it brings impartiality. It's not just us saying something that needs to be done. It comes with a credible weight of a research institution which has gone towards assembling and presenting data and shaping conclusions. And obviously there's a benefit of peer review. So as I said, 2 recent positive experiences of UPGro and WashTech here. Now, perhaps I'm speaking on behalf of researchers here, but perhaps some benefits that academic institutions get out of partnering with us are access to remote locations and communities to undertake research activities. They get the perspectives of practitioners who are on the front line, who are engaged in the delivery of services. They have a lot to say about the challenges that they face. And a lot that's been talked about today, pathways to impact, convening power of organizations like WaterAid, other NGOs working in the WASH sector, to bring government institutions and local groups together to work with researchers on findings. So I'm going to talk through some unhelpful difficulties that are sometimes experienced. And now, thankfully, this UPGro line of funding, I haven't experienced any of these difficulties at all. It's really encouraged us to work together effectively. But there are, in the broader sphere of development and research and practice, some of these unhelpful perceptions, I'll call them. Things like practitioners don't read and academics don't practice. You sometimes hear that said. And there is some element of truth in this one. I mean, if you're a practitioner, how do you access academic research when it's behind a paywall or in a journal? I mean, obviously organizations like ODI don't do that. You can access ODI research on the net. But accessing a lot of academic research and BGS research, you can get it on the website. But accessing academic research, a lot of papers are behind a paywall in a paid journal. So yes, indeed, how can we read that? But it's not just people having this saying, you know, that practitioners don't read and academics don't practice. It's a sort of them and us attitude. So I'll talk a bit more about that. You sometimes hear it said that NGOs, practitioners don't know what they're doing. I see that quite a lot. It's quite interesting when I see that. Often, sometimes the people saying it, you wonder when they were last in the field and observed this. Maybe perhaps it's secondary information. I mean, there are thousands of NGOs working on different issues, and definitely there are going to be problems. It's a very challenging environment, and some for sure will be engaged in malpractice. But to say that all NGOs don't know what they're doing maybe is a bit extreme. And then sometimes you see about publications produced by NGOs that it's said sometimes that the conclusions formed by NGOs are opinions rather than evidence-based. Now, I've even seen that said about a publication that's been put together with a number of other agencies. And it was pulled together by 2 leading academics plus a PhD candidate, yet was branded as the opinions of NGOs. People are not reading maybe the second page where the authors are listed. Before making that judgment, they just see the NGO logos on the front. So it can be an unhelpful perception that exists. And then from the practitioner side, you sometimes hear people saying that academic research is abstract with limited relevance on the ground, which obviously is not true. So these unhelpful perceptions exist on both sides. So it can lead to problems if further down the line, if there is this discord within teams working jointly, practitioners and researchers on projects. I mean, you can get incomplete literature reviews. Let's say if someone junior has been assigned to do the literature review as part of the research organization's contribution, it may not cover all of the existing literature that is out there. Sometimes you see that research simply just tells us what we already know, or research makes practice recommendations, but it hasn't adequately considered what we do in our practice already. So it's important to get alignment there. And just very briefly now, because time is running out, some things that I think everyone in this room knows already, as a result of having worked on UPGro, as a result of just working in the general direction that research and practice working together seems to be moving. But practitioners need to be included in research design, obviously, so that we don't get this situation where practice recommendations are made that we already know about or that are relevant to us. And if policy recommendations are to be made, it's important to involve government from the outset. So that's something that within certainly the hidden crisis work that John presented earlier, BGS is leading on, has been done from the outset to involve government from the outset, because there will be ultimately policy implications for this research. And when you just bring that to governments at the end or even halfway through, if you've even begun the project and you begin to approach governments afterwards, they can think that you're just going along without them. So it's very important to involve them from the very beginning, before you start work. Maybe I'm speaking the obvious here. There's just improved chances for institutional adoption doing things that way. So alignment of interests can sometimes be a challenge. Now, researchers, we've seen this morning, it was said that impact is certainly measured in terms of things being published in an academic journal. I wouldn't disagree with that. That is impact, certainly. But it isn't always this sort of impact that we as practitioners want to see. We want to go to get answers, simple answers sometimes, and we want to see impact on the ground. And that means going much further than publishing a paper, obviously, as we've seen. And then there is this other issue, which is kind of related. Something that might be regarded by researchers as contamination could be regarded by us as actually success or scaling up. There's a prevalence of RCT, randomized control trials, in the research and practice efforts going on at the moment. There's some researchers are really pushing for randomized control trials where you select a random sample of communities, analyze this, introduce something there, analyze the impact, and you leave controls blank with no intervention. Now, if things from the study communities start to spread into the control communities, such as improved services, then we would regard that as a success. But it could be seen as contamination in a very heavily controlled trial. So it's just about aligning interests and expectations there. And then when we were involved in facilitation of research visits to areas, there are often extremely challenging logistical issues that have to be overcome, and they really need to be appreciated. There are many program activities underway, and it's difficult to coordinate visits. You have the rainy seasons, you have social and political instability that means programs have to go on hold or be shut down. And these can impact on research methods, so it's good to have flexibility in there in the research method for that kind of event. Again, maybe I'm talking the obvious here. But yeah, I have to say as well, I mean, we as an organization, as WaterAid, have a responsibility when we engage with researchers to make sure that we are coordinated and aligned internally ourselves before engaging researchers. I mean, within the organization, we've got a policy team, we've got a program team, we've also got UK office, regional teams, country programs, many different teams with different interests, may have different interests in what they want to get out of the research. And if one of those teams engages research, maybe without the other, and the research is making practice recommendations or policy recommendations without the engagement of the policy team or program team or countries, then that piece of research may not reach its full potential. It may not be used because those recommendations may not be owned by those different areas within the organization itself. I mean, I'm sure a lot of organizations experience this kind of issue with the need for internal alignment, but certainly it is a challenge that can be overcome, and I'm happy to say often is. Yeah. So just to conclude, really, what I've been saying here, it's important to have alignment of interests and expectations, mutual respect between practitioners and researchers, and research methods co-designed with practitioners. They can bring a lot to the research methods and certainly flag up a lot of challenges that may come up later on in implementation of the research at an early stage. And then it's also important to sort of jointly shape the conclusions as well, because practitioners can bring a context to the shaping of those conclusions. And it's important to involve government if you are going to be making policy recommendations and engage them in the research process as you go along. And that point has been made a few times today, which is great. So all in all, I would say that the experience with UPGro has been fantastic, and we haven't encountered any of these issues, I don't think. So that's great. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vinny. That's a great way to introduce this final discussion. And really, we have as much or as little time as you have appetite for to follow up on things which Vinny has just raised, or indeed on any other issues that have come up in the presentations you've heard today or the discussions you've been having in breaks. So I will stop talking and hand over to you. Who wants to kick off? I don't mind a little silence while you think. Oh. Naomi.
Yeah, thank you, Vinny. Obviously, I was involved in that piece of research, and I think the relationship did work quite well. But it'd be interesting to hear from some of the other UPGro grants about how they were engaging with government and other stakeholders and how that worked, and maybe what some of the challenges were that were faced.
Would any of the other either UPGro Catalyst projects holders or indeed anybody else who's been trying to do groundwater research and with a view to influencing some sort of change, anybody like to come back on that?
Yeah. Completely different question.
Oh, if it's a different question, just hold on a second. Let's just see. Fabio.
Thanks. I can give you my experience in the project that we are running with the University of Dakar and the National Water Authority in Guinea and UNICEF. What are the problems of working together that we found it? First of all, that for university is not easy to understand, especially for Italian university, that they don't have such a international relation with Africa or Latin America or Asia. That when you work with some institution like the Minister of Water in Guinea, the technical level of your collaborator is not at the technical level you expect as a university. So to explain my colleague in the university that, I mean, for example, the director of the Minister of Water in Guinea, they are not reading every hour the email, or they are not using software, specific software. It's not easy. So sometimes I found that the university, they don't understand the language of some institution in Africa where the technical level is low. But I mean, the history has been different, so that we have not used to work with them. So that was one of the reasons. Another aspect that we found difficult is that our UPGro project was last 1 year, and some organization like the university from one side and UNICEF from the other side, they take almost 1.5 years to make a formal agreement, because institutions like UN, they are not so easy to involve. So every time I have a very good collaboration with the technical people from UN, but whenever we have to do some activity together, they need authorization, and it means that they have to have the authorization for the deputy director and everything. So I think that in our experience, putting together institutions that have different system of works in a project of 1 year and 1.5 years has been really a nightmare. Till now, we don't have a formal agreement with UNICEF because the deputy director has changed. So that's one of the reasons. And what I found difficult, I mean, I'm coming from the NGO, I was working with the UNICEF, and now I'm in the university, so I understand a little bit the language of all the three institutions, but to make them understand the language they use it is very difficult sometimes. Thanks.
Thank you, Fabio. Anybody else?
Yeah, maybe I can also share some experiences, because we So for those of you who are not in this session just now, we focus on a concrete development decision, and we try to like basically co-produce a model on the decision together with practitioners and the government. And I mean, obviously our work would not even have been possible without engaging intensively with those people. And like we started off with a completely open one-day workshop where basically everybody got to tell us what they think this particular decision entails, what the context is, and all those things. And without this engagement, I think we would have been completely off topic with our study. So I mean, learning about the local context, the background of this decision was absolutely critical for us, and it also certainly allowed us to involve people early and ensure that some lessons were learned at the political level, at the practitioner level. Through our research, we actually had a few people changing their opinions. We had a survey like, did this have an effect on you? And they actually did. And I think the reason was that we started at the very beginning and basically kept talking to people all the way through. So I mean, that's been our experience has been very good. And I think, yeah, as I said, we would have been pretty irrelevant if we hadn't actually done that.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm just going to take one more on this topic, which is an online contribution. We've had a very faithful follower from Switzerland all day, Sean Fury from SCAT, asking Vinny, in what form is it best to communicate research findings to country staff, partners and government staff and get feedback on what's effective?
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Sean, for that. Good question. Very good question. So essentially producing the report in draft format, first of all, for review in country is a good step, but essentially the reports are obviously very long usually, and it's best, I think, to get everyone together into a meeting setting and get time set aside in country to bring in the relevant country staff to review the draft findings and get their input, but not only the country staff but the partners who've been engaged in the work to the capital city, to the head office of the NGO, and go through the draft conclusions in detail. Now, the partners should have a good idea of what those draft conclusions are because they've been in the field work, and they've seen firsthand what the challenges are that are being looked at. But to get concrete agreement on the conclusions and on recommendations, I think a meeting setting is really the best way to do that, because through discussion, people will have different perspectives on that. But just producing a report and sending it over and saying, can you comment on the draft? Definitely, that's not going to really be much use at all, and it may not get to the partner offices either. So, yeah, I would suggest that would be the best way, and a meeting with government directly, obviously, as well. So that a meeting with key figures in the ministry who you would have met with before. This should come as no surprise to them that you've been working on this project. So they would hopefully, if they've got an interest in it, arrange to meet with you and listen to what you have to say. And if it has policy implementations, they may ask for more details or may tell you some of the challenges they face in making policies on these issues that you've raised. But definitely meetings is seemingly the best way, not just reports.
Thank you. Let's go here now on a different topic.
I had a two-part question about monitoring and evaluation. So the first one was, how easy is it to develop shared monitoring and evaluation frameworks in joint practitioner and academic research projects like UPGro? And the second part was around the monitoring and evaluation for water resource management. In the last session we talked about short-termism and long-termism, and obviously to see change in water resource management like groundwater resources, you need a lot longer time frame. Obviously funding is quite short, 3 to 5 year time frame, so how can we adapt monitoring and evaluation to monitor or show change in water resource management? But yeah, how can we do that effectively?
Thanks very much. Two related questions on monitoring and evaluation, but different. I'm going to throw those open to the floor, I think, and see, first of all, the question of shared M&E frameworks between researchers and practitioners. Does anybody from any of the projects or beyond have anything they can contribute on that?
Even if it's just challenges.
Yeah. Are we trying to monitor the same things from a research point of view and from a practice point of view? I don't know if we can bring the funders in as well. Ruth, I don't know if you have thoughts on that. It's not an easy question, I don't think.
It's not an easy question. It's particularly not an easy question for a UK research council that doesn't fund development work. But we do have monitoring and evaluation for our programmes. DFID, believe me, have a hell of a lot of monitoring and evaluation on their programmes. So we are looking at designing an UPGro monitoring and evaluation sort of approach with SCAT, and Richard's involved and Sean's involved in that. But that will be looking at the outcomes of the research, and we'll be looking at, obviously, I mean, we will look at a couple of years beyond the end of the projects, but we don't have the facility to go very long term. But I think it is two different things, because the research is about creating the evidence. It's not our job. We're not the practitioners. WaterAid are the practitioners. So they have, no doubt, their own sort of evaluation of how successful their projects have been. And I think it would be an interesting lesson to look at, you know, the gap between the two frameworks and how we could link them together. But that in itself is a very long-term approach, because it'll be 4 years before these projects have ended, a couple of years beyond that before you have really, you can judge the impact of the outcomes, a couple of years beyond that before really they get the full uptake by the practitioners, and WaterAid or other NGOs would be able to sort of do anything with it. Whether you could do it historically looking at previously funded work, which I have to admit would be, you know, something DFID funded or something like that. None of our collaborations with DFID are old enough to be able to do that, but it would be an interesting challenge, you're right.
On the second part of your question about monitoring for water resource management, or monitoring of water resources, I mean, I guess we've had some very contrasting contributions during the day from Martin this morning on the long-term data sets that the Grow Futures project is trying to assemble, which are not data sets belonging to that project, but they're the data sets of other institutions, government institutions. And then at the other extreme, we've got a number of the Catalyst projects which have instituted some monitoring. I mean, Jeff, I'm looking straight at you here. Yeah. And yet, you know, your funding has come to an end. It's uncertain as to how long that monitoring will be able to continue. So there are, some real challenges of using research as a vehicle to collect long-term data. Jeff, I don't know, or Jacob, if you want to chip in there.
In the project that we are working on, the mining company has invested over 10% of the entire project costs into data collection in terms of monitoring the environment, water quality, groundwater, rainfall, the entire climate data. They have an automatic weather station. The same to the irrigation farm. And we have entered into an MOU with them for data sharing, and also involving the Water Resources Management Authority, which is mandated with catchment management. So there's an agreement for data sharing amongst all the corporate organizations and also the Ministry of Water.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. Jeff?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that point. One concern I've got, which relates to what you were saying earlier, Vincent, is about raising expectations through these projects, and I'm painfully aware that we have raised expectations within Ethiopia and other countries with the work we are doing. We are looking for other sources of funding, which are not a great deal, to continue that monitoring as part of the PhD project. But I think that this is a real problem, both in terms of the short nature of all Research Council funding and how that can then be translated into some longer-term ownership of that monitoring programme. I don't have any answers because I think it's a problem in the UK as well as developing countries of Research Council funding for environmental monitoring, which needs to be long-term.
Thank you. Micah, do you? Yeah.
Yeah, I think for monitoring the impacts of a research or development project, I mean, the critical thing is really to have a thorough, a comprehensive conceptual model of your impact pathway. How do you actually expect to have impact? Because even if we have long-term monitoring on anything, we wouldn't even be able to attribute anything particularly to our project. It could come, I mean, like people's lives change because of all kinds of other reasons. But if we have kind of a logical chain of events that is triggered by our activity, that then ultimately leads to impact down the line, then we can at least monitor, and probably at the end of our project already, we can demonstrate, well, this next user of our data has changed its opinion now, and that was necessary for impacts to arise. Like in our example, we plant a lot of trees at World Agroforestry Center, and obviously by the end of our 5-year project, nobody has any more apples or any more bananas, but we have those trees and we can count the trees, and then we can say probably this will have impact. I think finding those intermediate indicators is key to effective monitoring of impact.
Does anybody else want to contribute on monitoring or anything else? Geraint.
Just a suggestion, but I mean, if research councils, etc., were to fund purely collection and monitoring data, then I would argue that the research which would go into the data that's collected would follow without any funding.
That's very definitely not our experience speaking to the community. Sorry, yeah, just to say, this is a perennial problem, and firstly to clarify one thing, certainly in the UK, NERC spends a very large percentage of its budget on funding long-term monitoring. That's largely what BGS, CEH, National Oceanography Centre, etc. do. They do a lot of long-term science. We do not have the budget to fund everything. In fact, our budget is going down, so we will have to stop doing stuff. But if we only did the long-term monitoring, and we have looked into this, nobody would be doing the research, and we wouldn't have any money to do anything new. So it is a balance. Nobody has enough money for everything, so it is prioritisation. In terms of carrying on projects in Africa, that's much more difficult for us because we don't have the logistics in place to manage it. But we do have experience of international projects, for example, working in India, where we have engaged with the stakeholders and have had things taken up long term by the local stakeholders. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to be looking at in these projects, and particularly these big consortium grants that have been funded that have the likes of WaterAid and lots of local stakeholders involved, can be looking at factoring that in from the start.
Thanks, Ruth. It relates to an online question. How can the policymakers in African countries get reliable data for policy and management of their underground resources? We don't actually know who that's from, but it does seem to me that one of the functions of projects such as some of the ones that we've been hearing about today is that they can assemble data. And again, I'm looking to Martin here with the Grow Futures project and the long-term data sets. And I don't know, Martin, if you'd like to comment on the extent to which those data sets are being made accessible to African governments and policymakers. You know, they're kind of being gathered in by Grow Futures, but are they being put out there as well?
Okay, I'm more of a climate specialist than a groundwater specialist, and luckily in the climate world there's been a long tradition and a lot of agreements on open access to data, much of which is facilitated by data centres in the UK, like the British Atmosphere Data Centre. In terms of groundwater, the equivalent would be IGRAC. That's I guess the main resource for global, site specific, but a global data set of groundwater. My understanding of that is that it's not quite that the raw data is not always available through that resource because it's there are issues of ownership around it. So that's one issue. And second, of course, groundwater data is having a time series of water level is not in itself probably sufficient to do adequate groundwater science in terms of needing other information on the geological context. That's my understanding. I mean, the satellite data sets like GRACE are all freely available to any researcher, relatively short term. What our experience from Grow Futures was that we are adding to the data sets that IGRAC already archive through agreements with the providers of that data. So in Tanzania, it was Richard Taylor's contacts actually with various officials in Tanzania that allowed access to that data. We published those papers with colleagues from Tanzania, which gives benefits, mutual benefits in that sense. And I think the idea of that, I think that he was promoting with Alan MacDonald at the last IHAS conference in Marrakesh in September was an attempt to bring together as many long-term data sets as possible. And it's more or less a call to anyone who has them, who feels that they can usefully deliver that data. And I think it would, I'm not quite sure, but I think it should go through IGRAC then. It should, the repository should be IGRAC for that. So in the end, I think we would hope that web resource would provide free and open access to as many data sets as possible.
Okay.
But it's a work in progress, I think, is my understanding.
Thanks very much. Yeah, David. Thank you.
Thanks. One initiative that might be worth mentioning, I mentioned it in the talk that I gave earlier on, is RayonWatch. This is something that's been pushed initially by the Africa Climate Exchange and a number of universities in the US, and it involves getting near to real-time Met data out of the national meteorological agencies and onto the internet, so that people that have a need to assess the status of water resources and agriculture dependent on rainfall have ready access to data that tells them what the kind of current status is. And I think there were a lot of challenges there in getting the data from the Met services initially, and a lot of time put into developing relationships. That those data have a value to them. I mean, they are sold, perhaps not in the form that's currently going up on the web, but and that, so there was a kind of issues around IPR, but I think the reason why it's been successful is that there's something tangible that comes out of that, and I think for the people that are collecting the data, a sense of achievement that what they're collecting is potentially making a difference, and there's still a lot of work to kind of highlight what's available there, but I think that's it's key that we are seen not to always just take, but to give something back. So I think that will kind of grease the wheels, certainly.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Who's next?
Out of curiosity, just I'm not involved with the UPGro project, but listening to this presentation throughout the day, I got a question in my mind that in Africa, the quantity of groundwater is a big problem. So, is the water security is defined by only the quantity, or that definition is compromising with the quality of the water? That's the question, actually. Is this?
Okay, thank you. A general question about groundwater resources in Africa and their sufficiency and their quality. I'm going to, I think, target that at one of our BGS colleagues, I think. There's a line up in the back row there. John, thank you.
I think the short answer is both, because there are UPGro projects here that have concentrated on, that have been represented here by James, that have concentrated on quality, and there are others who are not represented here, like the fluoride project, where, as in Asia, groundwater availability and security is compromised by natural quality constraints over quite large areas, and in some cases in areas where it's pretty difficult to find an alternative with the same level of cost and reliability. So I think you're right that our first thoughts are probably to quantity, but we still have to protect from pollution the resources that we do have. So I have a foot in both the quantity and the quality camp. So I'm always, reminding people that don't forget the quality.
Thank you.
I'd like to come back to Vinny's comment about the dissemination and how we communicate the results of these projects to practitioners, and relates to that again to that presentation this morning by Louisa, which actually looks at communication down all the levels. It seems almost as if the communication stops at government or try and get to the key users in the various countries. In fact, the real users on the ground will probably never hear of the results of this unless it's communicated down, which doesn't happen because Africa doesn't work that way. Knowledge very often is seen as power. And I've got to say, you train, you talk to someone, you give them a paper to read, they, as we were saying earlier, they immediately promoted into government office, and someone else comes through who's never heard of it. So in 5 years, this will have been forgotten unless we can get it beyond that level to practitioners, to the guys in the engineers in the pumping stations, in the field, working with the equipment with that. And I want to know, therefore, what we can do to actually take it. WaterAid are quite good at this because you got the officers right in the field, and I know you've made quite an effort, but I'm interested to know the results of this, because if it ends as a paper in an academic journal, that's the end of it. It's got to get beyond. And also just to tackle this issue of power, because also information is power. So you mentioned about like the climate data in Zimbabwe, you've got to buy it. People give it to the Met Office, but then they've got to buy it back for $100. Well, no one's buying it. No one's using it because suddenly it's got a cost and a value. So your comments on that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I completely agree. That's a very good point. Getting the findings and any implications of those findings beyond central government, it's not going to happen, essentially. So, in the UPGro Hidden Crisis grant, one strategy that was pursued, which had some success but not complete success, I would say, was to involve the district water officers in the actual research itself, so being present in the field work. Now, we did have a challenge on that, and it relates to the point that you made about people moving through, staff changes. One of the districts was consistently staffed throughout the project, but the other one, the district water officer, wasn't present for a large part of the period that the research was happening in. They'd been reassigned somewhere else, and the post was vacant, so there was no one to engage. Now, unless you engage those district water officers, any implications for this research are not going to happen. Even if you sit down with the district water officer retrospectively and talk through what was found, unless they see it themselves, they may not be convinced. So I completely agree, it's a huge challenge, and we need to look at strategies to move beyond, the situation where staff change can just throw everything back to square one. And it happens all the time. It happens in happens in WaterAid. Yeah, you know, so it's a constant issue, a massive challenge, and I don't think it's been cracked. But you're right, that's where we should be looking to address efforts.
I think it's also worth adding to that in that particular project, other people who were consistently involved in the field were members of communities and also hand pump mechanics who were dismantling pumps and seeing what the problems were, although they probably could have told us what the problems were in the first place. But I was very struck with Jeff Parkin's presentation earlier, where he was talking about community monitoring of water resources and then communities using that information and knowledge to better manage their own resources without needing to refer up to even local government. And I think there's a lot of future in that sort of approach. Where next? Roger.
Well, just I mean, a general comment on the nature of research programs. I mean, I've not been heavily involved in UPGro, and it's a long time since I read the TOR. But what I like in a research program is intellectual honesty. When they say, we can fund you to do that, but doing that is a step too far. What I dislike are research programs, of which I'm increasingly have to deal with, where one has to enter a kind of fantasy land of simultaneously delivering poverty alleviation for 1 million people, 3 changes in national policy, very little spend by the researchers, and gold-plated publications in Scientific American and Nature, all for £100,000. And that, because people are pushed by accountabilities here to value for money and managing for results, and push those too far, and you do risk entering a kind of fantasy land of pseudoscience and pseudo results. So, you know, it would be interesting to know how those people who've been working on the UPGro program have felt, honestly, how this program has worked for them, and whether there was an intellectual honesty in terms of delivery and impact.
I'm looking at you all. Who's going to take up that one? Anybody want to try and tackle that? John.
Not the whole answer, but part of the answer was that with the Catalyst grants, we were able to spread quite a small expenditure over quite a long time, really, in terms of getting the linkages that Vinny was talking about. So we weren't under dreadful time pressure to achieve results very quickly, and we were given time to put the teams together that could do some of the things that Vinny talked about. So I think that was a good thing of the Catalyst grants. It's not the whole answer to Roger, but
we didn't have user numbers.
Okay. Nobody else? Okay. I've got an online question here on a slightly different topic from a Nigerian participant, Michael Ale, who's the national president of the Association of Water Well Drilling Rig Owners and Practitioners. And Michael's question in summary is that there's little appreciation of groundwater in Nigeria, and there's a lot of indiscriminate drilling going on. It's reducing the price of drilling, but it's producing poor quality products. And what can be done about that? I put that question to you all. Sandy.
is we had a discussion on this in our group next door straight afterwards, because this is exactly what we're seeing elsewhere. That suddenly you can get a borehole drilled for, you know, $1,500 or $2,000 US. But when you put a camera down and look at the quality of the drilling, it's rubbish. The hole is bent, it's not to the correct depth, the casing is destroyed, the screen isn't where it's meant to be, it's the wrong design, everything goes wrong. And that's what's happening. It's a race for cheapness, and that's partly, I think it's partly because the way UNICEF are constructing the tenders, these wet hole tenders, which are almost fixed price and encourages quick drilling and it encourages bad practices. And alongside that, there is no way, we were talking about this earlier, there's no way of certifying the quality of a borehole, excepting that there's a pipe in the ground and it looks the right colour. So there is a big gap in that, which I think we're all becoming aware of, or those who are involved in the field are saying, hang on, we've got to look at this, we've got to address this. We can't just say, yep, I've got a 90-metre borehole. We're going to have a closer look at it. So those are the type of things which is part of good practice management, and I think the NGOs are becoming aware of that. It's not being rolled out fast enough, but it is there, and I think good practice, it's part of good practice now, which is also part not just of the drilling, but of the testing, I've got to say, which is another bugbear of mine. They do a quick blow test, and they say it'll give you 3 cubic meters an hour, and well, that's rubbish. There is a standard now for drilling and for testing, and we've got to look at applying these properly.
Yeah. I mean, we have a lot of good practice documented, but a lot of good practice simply isn't being practiced. Supervision is something that we, as a sector, we fall down on very badly, and regulation of the groundwater environment. I don't know how many of you are aware of the work that the Rural Water Supply Network has done over the years on cost-effective boreholes, but that was a deliberately chosen title to reflect the fact that we're trying not just to reduce the cost of boreholes and produce cheap boreholes, but ones which are functional and fit for purpose, but at a realistic price. Whether they're manually drilled, as Fabio was describing earlier, or whether they're machine drilled and deep. It doesn't matter. It's horses for courses. Okay, I'm aware of time, and I'm aware that it's Friday afternoon, and if any of you sort of tap your watches and look at me in a meaningful way, I'll know that it's time to finish. But are there any other issues that anybody wants to bring up? Yeah, grind. Who said there's always one? Thank you, Greg.
I just want to go back to the data thing again. I'm wondering, in the UPGro Catalyst projects, will all the data that is collected to support the research be open to anyone's eyes for to do their own research or whatever it might be?
I think I'd like to ask Ruth to respond to that. I think the short answer is yes, isn't it? Because there is a system for exactly that.
It is a requirement of all NERC funding, all ESRC funding, and DFID funding, that the data is lodged in an appropriate place and is made freely available. Certainly the baseline data, not necessarily the value-added products that have IP attached, but the data will all be archived in the NERC Earth Sciences data centre that BGS host, and it will be there in perpetuity as far as we can. As we know. I mean, we are committed to archiving the data for 50 years hence. Yeah.
Will it be on a sort of?
Hold on, microphone.
An archive is only as accessible as the sort of the forum that you can enter into the data set. Will it be on a sort of open source map or anything like that to allow easy access of that data, or will it just be in a spreadsheet somewhere?
No, it's a proper data centre. Sorry, I guess you're not familiar with the Research Council's model. We have a data portal you go into, all the data is there, it's all saved to the standard formats, all the metadata is there, and it's all searchable. It's actually, it's all done to international standards. We're part of all the international dialogues on archiving data, open data, core data stuff, all that kind of stuff. We work on all those issues. So, I mean, the data centres that NERC has, and it has several for each of the disciplines, all operate under that principle. So all the data is, you go in through the portal, it's all searchable. Our data centres can help you if you have queries, if there's things you don't understand, if there's things you can't access, it's all there.
Ruth, while you're on the mic, would you like to say something about publication as well? Is there a policy of open access publication?
Yeah. The open access is a, for those in the UK academic sort of landscape, you'll know that there are block grants for open access have gone to the universities from the research councils, so to make publications open access. It's also a requirement of DFID funding that the publications are open access, so funding for the overseas institutes in the UPGro projects can be included to make things open access as well.
Thanks. Joel.
Just a quick comment. I think it's really good to have the conversation about how we go about the knowledge brokering of this new research that's going to be done, but also, as we've just talked about, in terms of the borehole issues, the kind of the work you've done on site and of boreholes, we've got a lot of work to do as a community to disseminate the stuff that's already been done, and that can be as simple, from some of my experiences, as the fact the water table fluctuates over time, which isn't necessarily understood by some of those people who are monitoring, supervising the implementation of water projects. So I think we've got big challenges in terms of knowledge brokering all of this new research, but also there's a heck of a lot that's been done that we need to work hard at making sure it's in the right hands, understood, and being applied as well.
Thank you for that, Joel. And I think that might be a good comment to end on, actually. I mean, I agree with you. I think there's a huge amount of good knowledge and good practice which is well documented but not implemented. And so making that bridge from what we know to what really takes place on the ground and gets into policy is still a big issue, a big challenge for us. So I think, although it's not 5 o'clock, I was anticipating that we might finish a little early, and unless anybody has a burning issue that they want to bring up, and I don't see any hands, I don't see any comments. Oh, there is one. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll come back to you in a moment. Yep. It's an announcement rather than a question. I'm just going to just make a few quick closing remarks. I'm not going to sum up or anything like that, but just to say some thanks to many people, not by name, but a big thanks to ODI, particularly the water team and the comms and facilities people here for making this event possible. To our 3 keynote speakers, to Ruth, to Louise, and to Vinny, and to 17 other presenters who I won't name for obvious reasons, but thank you very much to all of you. To the chairs of the different sessions, and to the funding organisations, NERC, ESRC, and DFID, the 3 research funding bodies. And watch this space for a lot more from the UPGro consortium grants, from the knowledge broker team. I'm sure we'll have meetings like this in future, both here in this country, but also more widely afield. So thank you to everybody. Thank you to you for participating. And before we do close and leave, Kirsten Conti just wants to make a very quick announcement, and Naomi. Yeah, so Kirsten first.
Yeah.